As teachers of Chinese, we need not only to understand how to teach grammar and pronunciation, but we also need to understand our students. And so we're now going to think about what's called language learning styles. Before I get into the lecture, I want you to download from the website these 3 questionnaires and complete them before you start watching the lecture, because we'll be referring to them as we go through the lecture. So there's 3 of them, one with 10 questions, the second one with 24, and the third one with 15. Why are learning styles important? Well, when you discover your student's learning style, it can make a big difference to the way you teach them. Particularly if you discover that the way that you prefer to learn languages and your students' learning styles are different. Let me first start off by telling you a sad story. It was when I was learning the Taiwanese language in Taiwan. All the other teachers' names I've forgotten, but one I remember very clearly, 葛老师. Now, why do I remember 葛老师's name? Because eventually I hated being in his class. And the problem is, in the school where I was studying, it was all one-on-one, so there was nowhere to hide. Now, why did I eventually hate being in 葛老师's class? Well, every day went something like this. He would say, Martin, say this sentence after me. 我明仔載要去高雄. And I would say, 我明仔載要去高雄. And he'd say, no, you haven't got it right. Say it after me. 我明仔載要去高雄. And I would go, 我明仔載要去高雄. No, he said, you've got it wrong. Say it after me. And this went on and on. And I used to say to 葛老师, would you please write that sentence on the blackboard? And he would say, no, there's no need to. You just say it after me until you get it right. But the problem was, after class, as I walked home, I realized, oh, I'm a failure at learning languages. But the problem was that 葛老师 is someone who is strongly auditory, but I am someone who is strongly visual and weak auditory, and I need to see it written down. But the problem was, teacher Ge was unwilling to cooperate with my learning style. And so every day, as I walked home from school, I thought, I'll never be able to learn the Taiwanese language. Now, when we think about learning styles, there's 3 different areas, 3 different aspects. One is to do with the mind, another area is to do with the senses, and the third area is to do with the personality. And so we'll start off by thinking about the mind. And now you need to get the first questionnaire out, which had 10 questions, and you chose some that you said, oh, you were A, maybe, and others you were B. Just add up how many A's and how many B's you got. Now, if you had more A's than B's, it means that you're more of an analytical learner. What does that mean? Well, you're someone who is organized, someone who likes to think logically, someone who is fairly disciplined, someone who likes details and facts, someone who likes to look at things and study things step by step, and someone who's very goal-orientated. This is me. This is me. All those are me. One thing I want to say before we move on is, you may say, yes, but I had half A's and half B's, does that mean I'm schizophrenic? No, it doesn't mean you're schizophrenic. It actually is very good. Because when it comes to, say, understanding the grammar, you can use your analytical powers to understand the grammar. But when it comes to do the activity, you can use your the intuitive side of you to understand and do the activity. So actually it's very good. The sort of language learner that worries me are the extremes, particularly the extreme analytical. But we'll look at that in more detail in a minute. Now, the more analytical learner, the extreme analytical learner, what subjects at university do they normally like to study? I think something like accounting. I'm an accountant, something like accounting, or computer programming, writing programs for computers. Engineering. They're often extreme analyticals. They like to take things apart and see how they work and then put them back together again. So that's the sort of subjects an extreme analytical person would study at university. Now, if you had more B's than A's, you're an intuitive learner. What does that mean? Likes having fun, with no particular goal in mind. They use their intuition to see relationships. You see, that's the difference between an intuitive and an analytical. The intuitive is able to see the whole. They relate things by intuition, where the analytical person relates by logical, step-by-step reasoning. Also, they prefer the new and the novel and dreams. What sort of subjects would the more extreme intuitive study at university? Well, I think probably say music, using your feeling, art, something like that. Now, I want you to look at the next slide and say to yourself, which side grabs your attention first? The right side or the left side? What you say is that it's probably the intuitives who grabbed by the right side. They like to see the whole. Where the analyticals, they like to analyze the parts. Oh, isn't this fascinating? The pistil can be broken down into the ovary, the stigma, and the style. Is that interesting? I don't think it's 100% correct, but I think generally speaking, it is. Now, the key thing is, therefore, is how do we think more deeply about analytical language learners? Well, what do they enjoy? Obviously, they enjoy the grammar rules. And if you think about it, those who write language textbooks are probably more analytically minded so that they can analyze the grammar. And so often intuitives have a hard time if a textbook was written by a strong analytical. They like the grammar rules. What else is it? They like learning in the classroom, one-on-one. They like to study by themselves. And obviously they're particularly interested in the structure of the language. This is the analytical that they enjoy, where the intuitive is very different. The intuitive learners, what do they enjoy? They enjoy being creative. They like small group discussion, role play. They use their intuition to get a grasp on the language. They like stories and dialogues, and obviously they like to see the whole picture. Now, as teachers, the key question is, well, how do we teach? Well, just before we start into that, you're probably thinking, well, how do I know what sort of student I'm teaching? Is he analytical? or intuitive? Well, obviously you can give them that questionnaire that you've just filled in. But one quick way of discovering whether they're analytical or intuitive is to ask them a sentence in Chinese, a question. Ask them a question. You're not interested in the answer, but what you're interested in is how they processed the question. For instance, let me ask this question. 你明天要不要跟我一起去北京看颐和园？ 要不要？你明天要不要跟我一起去北京看颐和园？ The analytical learner, they have to understand every word in the sentence until they feel they're okay to be able to begin to get their answer ready. And the problem for analyticals is there is just one word in the sentence that they don't understand, they're stuck there. And so they have to say, please say the sentence again and again until they understand every word. Where the intuitives in a mysterious way, mysterious particularly for the analyticals, the intuitives take in the whole sentence and say, well, I think he's saying, let's go together to Beijing, oh yes, that's the capital, and to see something. Now, what do people normally see in Beijing? Oh, probably the Summer Palace. And so they use their intuition. They take in the whole sentence and go for a feel of what they think the speaker is probably saying. And they're normally right. So, analyticals, how do we teach them? Well, first, clear explanations of the grammar. And that's not easy if you're an intuitive sort of person. We'll think more about that later on, how we can handle that. But the students looking for clear explanations of the grammar. And the students focusing on the details and facts, so you need to be ready for that. You need to have thought carefully through the lesson, how to teach it. And therefore, obviously, you need to prepare well for class. But this is very key. You must not neglect practice. You see, the problem with the analytical, particularly extreme analytical learners, is that they've got lots of grammar questions they want you to answer. And if you're not careful, particularly if you're someone who enjoys trying to answer their questions because you're analytical, you can spend the whole class hour just talking about the structure of the language, and yet the student never gets fluent. So we need to again think about that in more detail. Also, as regards the analytical learner is, because they have all these grammar questions, they're going to go slower, especially in the early days, than the intuitive learner. And the problem is, they handle that. You see, they feel that these grammar questions are very important. They feel they must get a really good foundation in the grammar, in the language. And so they ask all these questions. But the problem is, they're probably not getting very fluent. And then they notice that another student who started learning Chinese at the same time as they did is moving on much faster. And the problem is, can they handle it? And you as a teacher, there's no point in you saying, oh, you should go faster, you should go faster. To them, getting a firm foundation, a good handle on the grammar is very key. But the problem is, you must also at the same time not neglect practice. And so what I suggest is that what you say to them, especially extreme analyticals, is we're just going to spend 10 or 15 minutes of each lesson answering your grammar questions, and then we're going to move on to the dialogue and the activity, because it's important that you get fluent in the language. So you have to restrict the time, else it's not helpful for them. Now, the intuitives, how to teach, I think they're much easier. You need to allow the student to discover the grammar rules from the story. If the student can't quote the grammar, subject, verb, object, that's not key. That's not so important. What is key is what's coming out of their mouths accurate? If they can't quote the grammar rule, it doesn't really matter too much. And so you want to use role play. You want games and activities. You also need to be flexible with this sort of student, where the analytical is probably enjoying going through the same way every day. With the intuitive, they're flexible. They want to have a fun time, and therefore you need to be friendly. Okay. This is looking at the analytical as against the intuitive learner. Let's move on. There was a linguist, doesn't matter his name, who said, okay, there's analytical sorts of learners, thinking oriented, and there's intuitive learners who go more by feeling. It doesn't mean they don't think, but they go by gut reaction, their feeling. But he said, you can also look at it another way. There's active, more impulsive, more risk-taking students, as against those who are more reflective, who like to think deeply, who like to ponder. I often like to say, you know, think back to primary school, and the teacher says, 3 + 4 equals, and the student puts their hand up, I know, it's 8. And the teacher says, now think before putting your hand up. You see, that's the more impulsive, risk-taking sort. Where the teacher says 3 + 4 equals, and Mary, what's the answer? Come on, Mary. We don't have time to wait for you. Come on. But she likes to think before answering. And so what this linguist, Kolb, said is, we can actually divide students into 4 sorts. And if you know the personality test, DISC, it fits very nicely into that. So let's spend a little while thinking about this. And I want you to get out that questionnaire that had 24 questions on it, had 24 questions on it, and you should have put a ring round those that you said, oh yes, that's me, that's me. So let's look at them one by one. Let's first look at the high D. Look at your piece of paper, and I'm going to call out some numbers that are relevant to the high D. Are you ready? 1, 5, 9, 13, 17, 21. I'll say it again. 1, 5, 9, 13, 17, 21. If you had 5 or 6 of those, then you're what we could say is a high D learner. Often the sort of leader sort of person, action-oriented. They learn by trial and error. They like challenge, flexibility, taking risks. They act on their gut feelings. And they like hands-on experience. All right, let's come back to that learner in a few minutes. Now let's look at the I learner. Just check off these numbers. Did you put a ring round 2, 6, 10, 14, 18, 22? I'll say again. 2, 6, 10, 14, 18, 22. If you had 5 or 6 of those, then you're what we say is a high I learner. What does that person look like? They're more meaning-oriented, and also they're very big on friendships, personal relationships. They like to reflect and look for meaning. They like to ask why. But also, particularly this is important for language learners, they value personal relationships. They're sensitive to feelings. And therefore the teacher can be their motivator. If the teacher's willing to be their friend, they can motivate them, particularly when the teacher gives them positive feedback, because they go very much on their feelings. If the teacher can encourage them by giving them positive feedback, this is a strong motivator for them. That's the high I, the meaning-oriented learner. Now let's look at the next one, the high S. I'm going to call out some more numbers. 3, 7, 11, 15, 19, 23. I'll say it again. 3, 7, 11, 15, 19, 23. If you had 5 or 6 of those, then you're a high S learner. What does this mean? They're very solution-oriented people. They integrate theory and practice. They're interested a little in theory, but they're always thinking, how can I use what I'm learning? How can I use the theory I'm acquiring, put it into practice? They like structure and clear instructions. They like practical solutions to problems, always thinking about how to solve problems. They're very practically minded people. And they like traditional classrooms. They like to please the teacher. So in that respect, they're sort of easy to teach, nice students, more conservative sort of people. This is the high S student. We'll come back to them in a minute. Finally, the high C student. Let me read out some numbers. 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24. Say again. 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24. These people are theory-oriented. They like to research things. And so they love acquiring facts and increasing their knowledge. They love to analyze the grammar rules. And therefore, they respect the expert's viewpoint. And so they're looking to the teacher to be an expert. And they like abstract concepts and ideas. There was someone called Greg Thompson who wrote an article, and I love the title. I think he was thinking about these high C learners. The title of the article was, "Leave me alone, can't you see I'm trying to learn your language?" I love that. Leave me alone, can't you see I'm trying to learn your language? That's these sort of people. Well, we'll certainly need to come back and think more about how to teach these in a minute. But let's go back to the high D, the action-oriented, the more leadership sort of person. They want, what sort of teacher do you think they want? Well, they want a teacher who gives the student a challenge. They want lots of variety. They don't want every day the same approach to learning the language. They want variety. And therefore, they want a flexible teaching method. And so if you're someone who's going to teach the same way every day, this sort of student's going to get quickly bored, and they'll tell you how to teach, which actually is quite good, I think, because they're going to give you some ideas that are worth thinking about. So this sort of student, if they don't like the way you teach, they're going to take over the class and tell you how to teach. And so you need to allow the students to take risks. And the lesson content must be practical. So this student is going to be bored with the same approach. They want variety. They want challenge. They want to be allowed to take risks. Not easy to teach, but actually it's good occasionally to have this sort of student. It's good for you, the teacher. They're going to challenge you to think how to teach better. All right, let's look at the meaning-oriented, the high I, the person who wants to be friends. They want a teacher who is not high and mighty. In Chinese, we say 高高在上. They don't want someone who is high and mighty. And it's important because they regard friendships as important. They're going by their feelings, that you give them positive feedback. And in this way, you're going to encourage them. You also need to give them time to think because they have these why questions in their mind. And therefore, also, you need to continually affirm them, because when you affirm them, you're going to motivate them, you're going to encourage them. But because they value friendships, you've got to allow them time to chat. And note this, they want to be friends with the other students, but they'd also like to be a friend of you, with you. And so it's helpful, maybe you go out for a meal occasionally with them or something like that. They're going to appreciate the teacher who is not just simply the teacher in class, but is willing to be the friend outside of class. Now let's look at the high S, the solution-oriented learner. They want a teacher who, when I say the lesson content is practical, what's key with this sort of student is that when you start off a new lesson, you want to say to the student, what we're going to learn now is really useful. You see, remember, they're not so interested in theory, they're more solution, they're more practically minded. And so if you say, oh, what we're going to learn today is really useful, it's about going to the market and buying fruit and vegetables, then this students will be excited to learn. Also, they like instructions that are clear, and therefore you have to prepare thoroughly, because they want a teacher who's going to teach step by step. They like order. This person is very much me. I'm one of these people, very practically minded, but I like my life to be ordered step by step. And so it's important as teachers that there's no surprises. You don't want to walk into class if you've got a high S student and say, oh, do you know, on the way to school today, I thought of a new way of teaching vocabulary, so let's try it out now. This sort of student will say, why didn't you tell me yesterday, or why didn't you send me a text message to let me know? They'd like to be prepared, no surprises. Finally, the theory-oriented learners, the high C, they want, the question is, do they need, we'll think about this in a minute, they want a teacher who teaches in a logical way, who teaches the grammar rules clearly, because remember, they've got lots of questions about the grammar they want you to answer. And therefore, you've got to be able to answer the students' questions well. But, as I said earlier, you could spend all your time talking about the language rather than talking the language. You see, they've got all these questions about the grammar of Chinese, and they're going to keep asking one after another. And if you're not careful, the whole time in class is talking about Chinese grammar rather than talking Chinese. So they never get fluent. And therefore, you've got to encourage them to talk and to practice. Now, you may say, oh dear, I'm more intuitive. I'm more a high I or something like that. What happens if I have one of these sorts of students? And what I often encourage teachers to do is to think about another language learner who's further along in Chinese, who is fairly extreme or very extremely analytical. And when your student, especially the high C student, comes along with all these grammar questions, that you say to them, listen, David, or whoever is that student, he could answer your questions much better. Why don't you go and ask him? And so the student will be much more satisfied because he's found someone else who's as extreme as himself and also can satisfy his thirst for knowledge. Okay? Now, let's have a little exam. Let's look at the teacher, who is a high I, that sort of friendly, likes to chat person, and the student is a high C, likes to research, likes to increase knowledge. I'm going to ask you, will this student enjoy having that sort of teacher? The answer is no. Why? Because the student has a thirst for knowledge, wants to increase their understanding of the grammar, but their teacher just likes to chat. And so the student will think, well, this teacher isn't a very good teacher. So a high C with a high I often doesn't work well. What about this? The teacher is a high S, solution-oriented, more stable, likes routine, likes each day the same, where the high D, the more leader, likes challenge, likes risks, likes flexibility. Will this student enjoy being with that teacher? Obviously the answer is no. Why? Because this teacher is going to teach the language the same way every day. We first look at the story, then we look at the new vocabulary, then we look at the grammar. And this person's going to get bored. They say, teacher, can't you think of a different approach to teaching the lesson? Okay? So this student wants variety, wants every day different, whereas the teacher enjoys having every day the same. What about this? The teacher is a high I, likes people, likes chatting, interpersonal relationships are important, and the student is also one of these people, high I. What's this classroom going to be like? Well, obviously there's going to be a lot of talking going on. I think often of, you know, the two of them talking away, and then suddenly the bell goes for the end of class, and the teacher says, oh dear, the first hour is already gone, and we haven't even opened the textbook. Next hour, we must open the textbook. Will they? Well, they might, but they probably won't look at it. But does that matter? It doesn't matter if the teacher is really familiar with the textbook and knows that today's lesson is, say, lesson 4, going to the market to buy fruit and vegetables. And so when the student walks into class, the teacher says, oh, have you been to the market recently? And the student said, oh yes, I went yesterday. And the teacher said, what did you buy? And the student says, I bought some bananas. And the teacher said, how much did you pay for them? Oh, I paid $100 a gin. And the teacher says, oh, you're being conned again. In other words, if the conversation is closely related to what that lesson is about, the student has found the right teacher. The student will be learning well. But if they simply talk about anything, that's not helpful. So if the teacher is someone who knows the textbook well, sticks to the lesson, but just simply chats the lesson most of the time, then the student will be learning fast. What about this? The student is a high C, the research sort wants to increase their knowledge, and the teacher is a high C. What's this classroom going to be like? Well, it's probably going to be very serious, fairly quiet as the student asks their questions, particularly about the grammar, and the teacher is delighted to show off her knowledge. But the key question is this good? Is this good? Well, if the student has gone to China to research Chinese, then they've found the right teacher. But if the student has gone to China to make friendships, to live there, to work there, this teacher is not going to help them get fluent. Maybe 1 hour a week have this high C teacher so the student can ask all their grammar questions and get the answers they want. But if every day the student has this high C teacher, the student will never get fluent because they'll be talking about Chinese every day rather than talking Chinese. And this is why understanding learning styles is so important. That we need to understand what goes together best, and that teachers, understanding their students' learning style, knows how to cooperate with them, but also at times knows how to challenge them. And the good teacher knows when to cooperate and when to challenge. All right, that's to do with the 4 DISC sorts of students. Now let's move on to the senses. And you need that questionnaire that had 15 questions on it. Okay, got it out? And you sort of put a ring around those that you say, oh yes, this is me. So, let's first look at visual learners. I'm going to call out some numbers to see whether or not you check them off. 1, 4, 7, 10, 13. I'll say it again. 1, 4, 7, 10, 13. If you have 4 or 5 of those, then you're a strongly visual learner. What are visual learners? They're people who prefer written instructions, obviously. They like to see it written down. They enjoy reading. They like pictures and charts. And also, they often like studying alone. Now, one thing we need to think about is if the visual learner, if it's visual analytical, supposing you bought a piece of software as an instruction book to go with it, what they like to see, the visual analytical, is 1, turn on the computer, 2, put in the disk, if we put in disk nowadays, 3, go to Windows, 1, 2, 3. But if the student is visual intuitive, what do they like to see in the instruction booklet? Yes, they like to see pictures and charts. They like to see the whole picture, as it were, in the manual. Okay, this is visual. Auditory learners. Did you check these off? Just have a look. 2, 5, 8, 11, 14. I'll say again. 2, 5, 8, 11, 14. If you had 4 or 5 of those, then you're strongly auditory. What does that mean? Let's have a look. It means you prefer obviously listening, oral teaching, listening to lectures, or small group discussion. And just in the same way we thought about visual learners, if you're auditory, analytical, I'll say it again, if you're auditory, analytical, you enjoy listening, say, to a lecture. My first point is blah, 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 blah. My second point, I'm going to split into 2A, 2B, 2C. My third point, blah, 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 blah. Okay? But if you're auditory intuitive, what do you enjoy? Talking with other people, small group discussion, not just a single me to you, but you like interaction. You like chatting with other people. Okay? Thirdly, hands-on learners. Hands-on learners. Check off these numbers. 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. If you had 4 or 5 of those, you're a hands-on learner. What's this? You prefer total physical involvement, handling objects, activities of movement, field trips. And I want you to note this, that if you have a student who is strongly hands-on, but is weak auditory and weak visual, it's very important that you give them opportunity to have activities, to handle the objects, to go outside. Often this type of learner, strongly hands-on, weak visual, weak auditory, is often branded a poor learner. But they may not be. It's purely that learning from a textbook with a teacher going through it doesn't suit them. And they need to get out and handle. You need to take them to the market to handle the fruits and vegetables and try buying them. That is the way that they learn best. Well, all right, let's come on to back to the visual learners. They want a teacher who makes pictures of the new vocabulary. The picture one side and the Chinese the other. Okay? And there's a different lecture on how to use these, how to play with them in class. Okay? They also want to first read the story along with the student, then the student reads it out to the teacher. In fact, if you think about this Ge Lao Shi, who I mentioned right at the beginning, who eventually I hated being in his class because he kept saying, please say after me. How should Ge Lao Shi have taught me so that I would have enjoyed his classes? And the principle is, first cooperate, then challenge. First cooperate with the student, then challenge the student. You see, the problem with Ge Lao Shi, it was, for me, it was all challenge, no cooperation. And so, if you have a student who is strongly visual, first you can read the story along with them. Please read after me. The student will like that. Then you can say to the student, all right, now you read it out to me and I'll correct it. That's the cooperation. Then move on to challenging them. You say, now don't look at the textbook, but then how should you teach? In a challenging way that the visual learner feels comfortable. Well, one thing is that you could get these vocabulary cards and make a story. We go to the market and I first bought some. And then I went and asked, what's the price of? And then finally, I bought some of this. Or you could draw it on the story on the board, and the student tells the story. Or you could act it out. The teacher's selling the fruit and vegetables. You have the vocabulary cards and some price labels. You see, it's allowing the students still to be able to use their strongly visual aspect, but they're not reading the Chinese. It's challenging them, but still allowing them to use their strongly visual aspect. And this is very important. Just one more thing about the strongly visual students. Actually, let's just put up, what else do we have here? Make charts of the grammar and encourage students to strengthen their listening ability. You see, the problem with the strongly visual student is weak auditory is when they go outside and someone says something to them, they often miss it, especially if they're visual analytical students. And so what I often encourage students who are frustrated is to say, well, listen to different